Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Find My Past from Home. And this is one that I'm exceptionally excited to be involved with because, of course, this is relating to Black Country history. And I have some ancestors of my own and all kinds of burning questions already. And I hope and I hear, especially from recent experiences, that I know some of you have a lot of Black Country ancestors as well. And I think a lot of this is going to be applicable to any of your industrial ancestors too, particularly in that great period of the Industrial Revolution going a bit further forward. I'm really delighted to be joined by Simon Briercliffe. He's a man that needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. He's the researcher at the Black Country Living History Museum, which is a fantastic place, and he's going to tell us a bit more about that. And he is a walking encyclopedia of all things West Midlands. He's just doing his PhD now at the moment on Irish immigration into Wolverhampton, and it's a really massive topic to cover, and so I'm really happy that we've got one of the leading experts here to talk about it. So I'm going to bring him in. Hi Simon, how are you?
All right.
I hope you're ready to be grilled by our wonderful, happy community.
No problem.
So the Black Country is something that I think, let's take some of our visitors from further afield. They might not know what the Black Country is. So could you give us a very quick summary of what we're talking about when we say that phrase?
Well, the Black Country is really just a very small industrial area in some respects. It's really the area to the north and west of Birmingham in the West Midlands of England. And it's only maybe about 100 square miles, but it was at its time one of the most productive coal mining areas in the country and therefore the world. It was one of the most productive iron manufacturing areas and various other trades besides. So it had a very, very substantial impact on the history of the Industrial Revolution, as well as being home, obviously, to lots of people that were working in those industries.
Fantastic. That's big. And why was it called the Black Country?
That's disputed, like many things about the Black Country. The two answers to that basically are that it was black under the ground because it was a huge coal mining area, and also black over the ground because it was one of the most polluted areas in the country and remained that way for many, many years. So the skies were black. The rumour is that when Queen Victoria had to come through on the train, that she had to draw the blinds on her carriage because she didn't want to look at such scenes of devastation. And several other people say, I think that's a myth, but several other people have made similar kind of descriptions of it. So if you've ever read the old Curiosity Shop, Little Nell goes through Wolverhampton, and there's a really good description of it there from Dickens' point of view, and it's very descriptive of all the industry, but particularly the kind of fire and blast furnace and smoke and that kind of horrific atmosphere as it would have been felt to a Victorian.
Wow, that's quite big. And so I know you work at the Black Country Living History Museum, and I think you've got some slides, haven't you, to explain a bit more about what you do there and your work. So let's hear a bit more about that. That would be really exciting.
Sure thing. Well, my first introduction was basically what we've just talked about, but I wanted to talk about what the Black Country was and where it is. So we've discussed that. I guess if there's one main thing you can take away from this is that it's not Birmingham. The Black Country is not Birmingham, and anybody will get very cross from the Black Country if you say they're from Birmingham. However, being next to such a big city, the economies have been kind of linked over time completely. The Black Country is where the coal and the iron was dug out of the ground and made into raw iron, and Birmingham is where things were made. The story's a lot more complicated than that, obviously, but the two have grown up in a kind of a symbiotic relationship over the last few hundred years. It's an area that was reached its peak several times, I would say, really. It was an early industrial area, so in the 18th century, before a lot of other places had really kicked off. We had the first steam engine in the country just down the road from the museum in Tipton. It was designed by Thomas Newcomen. That was 1712, so really, really early. In the mid 19th century was probably its productive peak, I would say. So, for example, in 1851 at the Great Exhibition in London, all of the ironwork for the structure was made in Dudley, and all of the glass was made in Smethwick, which is another part. But it remained important and a really important industrial area right through to the 1950s and 1960s. So the museum was set up just kind of after that period, and in the late 60s and 70s. So if you've ever come across a museum like Beamish in the north or Bliss Hill in Ironbridge, it's a similar sort of principle. We're a living museum, so we don't have text panels and objects in boxes very much. We have costume characters to tell the stories and to do these things in person. And we have buildings that have been mostly relocated to the site brick by brick. So this image might look familiar to some of you if you've ever watched Peaky Blinders, because it's filmed at the museum partly. And these are all real buildings. So the building at the back front is a rolling mill from Oldbury. The building next to it is an anchor making forge, and so on and so on. And we were a 26-acre site, and there's always a lot going on. Obviously, we're currently closed, but we'll be reopening in the middle of May. Our principle that we run on at the moment is real lives, real stories. So we don't tell, these are all real buildings and with a real history. They're not kind of notional histories, if you see what I mean. So we talk about real people, real ancestors, real stories of people's real lives, not just generally what it was like, although obviously we cover that. This is one of our demonstrators, John Homer, who's the person that we get in if ever we need the most authentic Black Country accent possible, because he's got a wonderful poet's voice. He's made a new life for himself as our star performer on TikTok. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but his videos get literally millions of views.
Wow.
He's also involved in our learning program, as a lot of the museum is, with schools that come in to talk about the Industrial Revolution. But we involve family history in that as well. So we'll teach kids to explore the histories within the buildings that we've got. So to use things like photographs, obviously, but also censuses and everything else to build up a picture of what it was like to be a child, for instance, in the 1890s and so on. So these are another example of buildings that moved from a village called Old Hill. And we know that the families that lived with them were kind of interrelated and all did similar kind of industries. That's Granny Newton, who lived in one of the houses. So we kind of refer to it as Granny Newton's cottage now.
So this process of, I'm guessing it must be such a big thing to move a building. Is it brick by brick, or is there a certain way that you can? Wow.
Yeah, it's a huge process, as you can imagine. It literally means numbering each of the bricks, taking them down individually, and transporting them over in pallets and rebuilding. Wow. And you've brought me nicely onto my final slide, because actually we're in a process of expanding the built environment of the museum. So at the moment, the original part of the site of the village it tells the kind of Victorian and Edwardian story, and we also have a 1930s street. But we're moving into the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So that will help tell an even wider range of stories and kind of explore the history of the Black Country through time. And as part of that, we're moving some buildings, so including a library and a aluminium foundry from various parts of the Black Country that no longer have a life where they are. One of the buildings that we're moving is actually one from the site already. We're moving it within our site. But to show the kind of interesting buildings we have, these are ordinary looking council houses from the outside, but they were actually constructed out of cast iron by Dudley Council in the 1920s. Obviously, they were lived in right the way through up until the 80s and 90s. So we talk to people, we supplement these family histories with oral histories, so recorded interviews. These brothers lived in one of the houses in the late 1960s, as you can probably guess by the moustaches. And obviously, we've done a ton of research for this. So I'm going to get my quick plug in here. That the research has been written up, and it's I think at the end of May, I'm hoping this book will be released, and that's my kind of history of the Black Country in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and the post-war period, broadly speaking. So, I mean, I could talk until I'm blue in the face, but probably best if we just kind of crack on with questions and answers, I guess.
Yes. So, I mean, the big thing that came out of that, I'm thinking, are these buildings, are you saving them from possibly, being replaced or demolished, or is it something that you're going out and looking for kind of prime examples that are in residence, and you sort of pick them out and buy them, I wouldn't say off the shelf, but from the owners?
It's a mixture, really. Actually, when the museum was set up in the 70s and 80s, actually a lot of buildings were just being knocked down. That was the period for it. That's not the case anymore. So our new development is a mixture of buildings that we're moving and buildings that we're replicating. So those ones are exactly prime examples of buildings that we want to show. So there's a co-op shop, for instance, but some of them have sort of come to the end of their life where they are. The prime example is a library building, the Victorian library building that we're moving across. That can no longer be used as a library because it's too old. And obviously there's libraries are being closed and there's less demand for the services in smaller locations now. But there's a covenant on it because the land was donated by the Earl of Dudley, saying that it has to be used for public good. So they can't build houses on it, they can't build shops on it and anything like that. So it's very difficult for the council to know what to do with it. So happily we can make use of it.
That's amazing. Have you got any kind of list or record of the buildings that you've moved along? Because I can only imagine how amazing it must be to go and visit the museum and find your great-great-grandparents' home or something like that you could walk around.
Yeah, they're all on the museum website. So if you look at our buildings, our site on the website, there's a list of them there.
That's brilliant. And I know I've been looking at these comments and seeing some fantastic people who have talked about going to the Living History Museum and how much they've enjoyed it. So I can see as we come through, when people saying hello.
It's the most important thing about the museum. It's efficiency, well recognised as being the best you can possibly get. Yeah, there you go.
Ricky Bennett wants to come back for some more, and I'm seeing a few more as we go through. I see. It's something to pick from. Chris Lang has been to the museum many times. Fascinating place full of history. A pint in Holden's pub. Fish and chips again. The sweet shop. A really great day out and a trip down the canal. I really like the idea of. I'm definitely going to take my nephews when it's open, I'm sure. But it's quite hard to get young folk, children, grandchildren involved in family history and what granny, great granny used to do and things. And what better way to do it than to get them interactive and showing things and having a go on a trolley bus and all kinds of things. It's quite
that's
quite
the
exciting.
idea. I mean, they have to be out of the pub, but we do have a sweet shop and we make our own sweets, so they can have a go at that.
Great stuff. And another museum question, Daphne asks, is there easy access to the museum?
If this means full access to kind of wheelchairs and things like that, it is a site that's designed to be historically authentic. So there are some tricky bits around the colliery area and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But we do our best to make it possible. Obviously, there's no access at the moment. For the main reason we're closed, and we're also a vaccination centre. So, but we're scheduled to open on 17th of May, and then there will be it'd be bookable access because we have to restrict our numbers.
Wow. Okay. There's I see Christine has asked, does a Black Country cover Bromsgrove?
No, I mean the boundaries of the Black Country are highly disputed. So I tend to think of them as what's now the boroughs of Dudley, Sandwell, Walsall, and the city of Wolverhampton. Mm-hmm. However, those have been long disputed. Really, the most accurate definition you could put would be to say it's the South Staffordshire coalfield, which crosses slightly into North Worcestershire. And it's the communities that have grown up related to that coalfield and the industry that it represents. So there are some peripheral towns like Stourbridge, Wolverhampton, even Walsall. They're actually on the edge of the coal mining area, just outside the coalfield itself, but wouldn't be there without the coalfield being there. So there's constant arguments about what's in and what's out of the Black Country. Bromsgrove, I think, would definitely be out. However, it has its similarities. Nail making, for instance, was a key trade for Bromsgrove in the 19th century, and that's something we do tell the story of at Black Country because it covers places like Dudley and Lye and Halesowen, which also specialised in nail making. There was a very poorly paid trade, very exploitative work, and a lot of it was similar. So it was brought up as an example of a sweated trade in the late 19th century. Bromsgrove nailers and chain makers from Cradley Heath were both given as key examples of that.
I see Christine asked about nail making and how much you cover that in the museum, so that's quite nicely covered that. I know Jackie's just said that she's lived for most of her adult life not far from Beamish. She's been to the Black Country Museum, the Black Country History Museum. She thinks it's brilliant, really informative, and tells us to keep up the good work, everyone who works there. And another question before I throw in a lot of my own, and keep asking questions, everyone, as well, if you have more. Christine asks, was Licky Rock an actual house in the rock? The 1841 census states Licky Rock as an address.
It's not what I'm familiar with. Like there are the Licky Hills, which are kind of to the south of Birmingham. So my guess is that there's the Licky Hills and the village of Licky End, which is amazing. And so Licky Rock could well be an actual house. Yeah.
I'm sure I remember an old story of someone living in a the cave kind of house, but I don't know if I'm mixing things together.
No, there's a village called Kinver, which is just outside the Black Country, really. And yeah, there are still cave houses there that were lived in up until the 1960s, and those are run by the National Trust.
Right, I see. And when we look at the Black Country itself, what made the Black Country special when we compare it to other parts of Britain? Why did everything happen here, do you think?
There's a couple of reasons. I think that the main one is its geology. So more than anything else, it's what's underneath the ground that has defined what the Black Country became. So the first of that is the coal. And not just any coal, but one of the thickest seams in the country, and so therefore one of the most productive in the country. So 30 feet deep at some points, and there's nothing else like it in the rest of the country. So that means that it was very accessible from very early on. So it industrialized quite early, hence the steam engine so early. There is also other minerals there. So there was iron ore under the ground, which could obviously be made into iron. There was fire clay, which you used to make furnaces and kilns, and various other materials. So other related trades that grew up are things like glass and brick making. So it's all to do with what's underground. So that was the prime driver of what made the Black Country unique. It was that it had those things in abundance and very early on. Other than that, in some ways, it's similar to other industrial areas. It's not a city; it's a group of smaller towns and villages that share some of the same characteristics. So it's not quite like Birmingham or Coventry, for instance, West Midlands. It's more like I don't know, the valleys or the central belt of Scotland or something like that. There's much smaller communities.
And when we talk about Birmingham being on the edge of the Black Country and I guess looming over everyone, what effect did that have on the population of the Black Country? Was there much movement between Birmingham and the Black Country, or was there a fairly static population? They didn't mix so much.
Did I disappear there?
Sorry, did you get my question?
No, I didn't.
Okay, this is proof that we're live, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. You see, this is the exciting thing. So I just said that you mentioned Birmingham being, right on the doorstep, and what effect did that have on the Black Country? Was there much movement between Birmingham and these towns and parishes, or were they quite separate and distinct?
The Black Country's always had a bit of a reputation as being quite insular. So even today, people from Birmingham don't like to say they don't want to go to the Black Country and vice versa. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. But it's very easy to trace if you look at some of the very small hamlets of just a few houses that grew up near a coal mine. People lived there for generations and didn't move, and married people from the same street and everything. So there's a degree of truth in that. However, of course, there was a huge amount of economic interaction between the Black Country and Birmingham. It was a key market. So, for instance, when the first canal opened from the Black Country into Birmingham, the price of coal in Birmingham dropped in half because it depended so much on the Black Country for its coal. In terms of moving backwards and forwards, yeah, of course, to some extent. But I think the backwards more characterised by people staying put, people moving in from the countryside and from other parts of the world to some extent into the area. But probably across the boundary lines there was a lot of movement. But most people seem to like to stick with the town that they knew.
Yeah. And were there sort of particular key groups or areas that these people moved to the Black Country, I guess, to support this growing industry? Were they coming from particular places at all?
Yeah, for definite. So the what would be typical for kind of across the country in industrial areas would be for people to move in from the surrounding counties. Then that's definitely true. So the key one for the Black Country, I think, is Shropshire. And particularly the kind of Coalbrookdale, Ironbridge area, which had its own industrial revolution and was doing some of the same sorts of things. But that has kind of started to decline by the early part of the 19th century. And so a lot of the masters, the iron masters, moved into the Black Country and set up factories, and a lot of the workers followed them. So there was a big influx in the first half of the 19th century for people from Shropshire moving into mining work. But people came from further afield as well. So one of the famous ones is Huguenots in the 16 and 1700s moving into the Stourbridge area in particular. Mm-hmm. They mentioned glass. That was what they were famous for in this area. So a lot of the early glass works were set up by Huguenot families from Lorraine in France, I think, or disputed territory for the last few hundred years. Then in the 19th century, in the mid-century, the Irish came, like they did with many other cities. Yeah. So earlier in the century, the Irish had moved to places like Liverpool and Manchester in large numbers to work at kind of unskilled work in cotton mills. In the Black Country, it was a bit later because there was less unskilled work and the less very large factories in the same way. So employment in the Black Country in the 19th century tended to be what was called small masters. So it'd be a small workshop with one employer employing a few men, and you had to know someone to be able to get a job there and so on. It was less like a huge faceless cotton mill with an employer who just picked up the first people he could find. However, after the famine in Ireland in particular, people were fleeing wherever they could, really. And that was from that point, kind of large communities grew up across the Black Country, particularly in Wolverhampton, Walsall and Wednesbury, I would say, were the largest groups. And then into the post-war period in the 20th century, we had shared a lot of the same experiences as other bigger cities. So we had groups from the Caribbean, from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, and from South Asia, particularly Sikhs from the Punjab in the 50s and 60s. So it's one of the largest concentrations of Sikhs outside of London and India, in fact, I think still. We had the first Gurdwara, the Sikh temple in Europe, first dedicated Gurdwara, and that was in Smethwick. And just as with the Irish before, 100 years before, there was, I could tell you horrible stories about how immigrants were received and the kind of the racism that was experienced. And in the Black Country, it seems to have been a fairly substantial amount of that.
And these, I know, I mean, I always find it interesting how things come full circle, and we kind of repeat the same experiences with say, different migrant populations and things. And I think we've all got an ancestor from Ireland or from some other part of the country and things, and we can think about where they've been and what they've done. I know you mentioned these different towns and villages and these the small trades. My two questions I can think of really is, first of all, I know you said that the Black Country is slightly insular, when we're talking about between Birmingham and that, but what about between these different parishes and these different towns and villages? Were they moving between towns very easily, or were they quite static across the whole of the Black Country?
I would say that they tended towards the static. So, for example, those cottages that I showed you, well, we've got the old photos compared to the new. They were that was at Old Hill. That was a nailing community in particular, and there was generations there that stayed there for long periods of time. Small hamlets, really, of just a few houses and kind of basics. But they stayed there and didn't move into the bigger cities automatically or the bigger towns. Obviously, there's some moving around. You go for where you can find work, but people tended to stay in their own kind of area. That was, I mean, partly dictated by geography. There's great big hills running down the middle of it. It was easier to stay on one side of the hills and look for work than it was for the other side of work. But like you also mentioned, there was a very high degree of kind of trade specification within each specialization. I mean, within each town and village. So certain areas grew up to be specialists in certain things. So the best example is probably Cradley Heath, which is in the south of the Black Country. The area around there had been making nails and things like very basic hammered metalwork for hundreds of years. And eventually somebody moved into making chains. And that was what really stuck. And that became, Cradley Heath became synonymous with chain making. Huge amounts, like 2/3 of the chains in this country were made in just this small town.
Wow.
And as a result of that, you get even more specialization. One of the most famous chain makers was called Noah Hingley. He ran a big firm. He tried to make it in Liverpool, obviously a maritime city where it makes more sense, and found the competition too crowded. So he moved back to Netherton, which is kind of the next village along, and set up a chain and anchor works. And yeah, he actually brought Irish anchor smiths down from Liverpool with him to work in that. So he brought the expertise back to him. And so you have the one of the centres of anchor making in the country being right in the middle of the country, as far as you could imagine from the sea. But we made the anchor for the Titanic in this little village of Netherton, and it was absolutely vast. It was like 24 horses to pull it down to the railway station. It was really something special.
Amazing. And so I know you've mentioned chains and nails and things, and I notice that our colleague, Findmypast genealogist that you all might recognise, Jen Baldwin, has joined, and we were talking only a little bit. She's got some ancestors from Birmingham who may have come from somewhere elsewhere, and her ancestors were silversmiths. And I know I've got gun lock makers and things, and locksmiths. Could you maybe talk about some of the other trades that were going on in the Black Country and where they tended to focus? So maybe it might give some people an idea, if they know the occupations of their ancestors and they're not quite sure where they may have come from, somewhere to maybe look for a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. I've got a nice long list. Well, just to start with, silversmithing and jewellery making, that was very much a Birmingham industry. So Birmingham has a jewellery quarter still, where it's absolutely full. It's when I got my wedding ring, and that's still. There's places you can visit to see small workshops, small kind of stamps and fly press kind of workshops there. And Birmingham also had its gun quarter, which was nearby to that. That became famous in the 18th century, really, for producing a huge amount of guns privately, as opposed to the military arsenals that were set up in places like Woolwich in London. So there were big gun makers, like the biggest one was Galton and Farmer. So Galton is a very famous name in the Midlands for various things. They were really an assembly line in many ways. So they put together the guns. They assembled them from components that had been bought from elsewhere. So a lot of those were made to order in the Black Country. Which is why you get professions like gunlock filers in Darlaston. It's a highly specialised. They'll be making the locks for guns, the bits you click back, I guess, and then filing them so that they were perfect. In Wednesbury, they specialised in barrels for muskets and things like this. So those are particularly interesting ones, I think, because they relied on a couple of things. Firstly, the military economy. Like for most of the 18th century, Britain was at war, especially towards the end with Napoleon and things on the scene. So obviously they did really well out of that. But also guns were made for the slave trade as objects to sell in Africa in exchange for people. So when the trade was abolished in 1807 and Waterloo in 1815, after that, everything just went completely downhill for these people. They were adaptable, though. In Wednesbury, they turned their skill at making barrels into a skill at making all kinds of other tubes, and became one of the centres of tube making of all kinds for the rest of the country. So that's where that kind of industry developed from. So in other places, you had. So Stourbridge, for instance, became. I'm going to do my mental map now. Stourbridge became famous for its glassware because of the materials there. Brierley Hill, just up the road, was a steel making town. It had a great big works called Round Oak, but it was also had very, very fine fire clay under the ground, so it made specialist bricks. In Willenhall, in the north of the Black Country, they made locks. So at one point, 90% of the locks sold in the world came from Willenhall, which is almost unbelievable, really. But again, it's very highly specialised. So firms like Yale and Chubb were based there. That's where they made their money. Walsall became famous for leatherwork and saddlery, and that's because before that it was famous for making the bits of metal that go with the saddles. And Bloxwich, which is a village just outside Walsall, was kind of a world centre for making awls, which is the things like metal punches which are used for punching through leather, obviously related to Walsall. Darlaston developed into making nuts and bolts, and there's bound to be more, but those are kind of the most famous examples I would guess. But so each town would have had an industry which excelled at. It had its expertise there, and therefore employers moved to the area to make use of the expertise within the area making these things, and you get this kind of clustering effect.
Well, that's I can see now. Every time you mentioned a place and an occupation, all of my ancestors from these places all undertook those occupations. So I've been marveling at that, and I had no idea about the percentage of locks. That's huge. It's quite hard to fathom. And in that extent, I'm imagining. I know you said that they fell on hard times when some big spurs to the industries fell away. But what was? I'm trying to get into the social life and what life was like for people who lived in the Black Country. I mean, when the Industrial Revolution comes along, there are all kinds of extra money flowing in, and I guess an element of a nouveau riche, or like a high society. In places like Yorkshire and Greater Manchester and things, you have mill owners and people who are then they're not aristocrats, but they're almost there. And did the Black Country have the same sort of thing? Was it a very working class area, or was there a cultural and social elite?
I mean, by proportion, of course, it was a very working class area. However, every town had its small elite of industrialists, particularly. So they tended to stay within their own town rather than to consider themselves the kind of lords over an area or anything wider than that. So Wolverhampton would have had its own elite, Dudley its own elite, Walsall its own elite, and they would be the main employers in the town, the clergy at the main churches, the doctors and lawyers and things like that. But there was small enough towns still for if you were a well-qualified solicitor or a doctor, then you could easily join the Freemasons or the Athenaeum Club or whatever and become part of high society. Not without too much difficulty. I mean, if you were a miner or a nail maker, you no chance. But if you were born into the middle class, you could easily stay in the middle class, and that was as posh as it got, really.
And was this change? I know we've talked about how life changed drastically in the Black Country with the Industrial Revolution. Was it quite quick, or was this a gradual step process?
I tend towards more gradual. In some other parts of the country, you had cities that were referred to as shock cities, so that built up very fast. I'm thinking of places like Middlesbrough or Barrow-in-Furness that grew out of sudden new, very large steelworks or shipbuilding yards or something like that. Because of the smallness of the employers, I would say that this grew up gradually. So there was still farming and things right throughout the Black Country going on right well into the 20th century, even though the whole of the area around it was filthy and riddled with holes from all the coal mines, but there was still farming there. Yeah.
Well, I've got some more questions that I can see coming through, and a few other people talking about different elements. And I noticed a question here from Linda. Was zinc in the equation anywhere in the area? Their ancestor moved from there down to London and had a zinc works.
You're testing my GCSE physics here. Like, I think zinc is involved in galvanizing. So in that sense, yes. There's a village called Lye, which became famous for, it kind of disparaged as being the place where you could buy buckets, but it was a place where galvanizing was a speciality. So anything from tin baths through to buckets, through to hollowware, which is saucepans, kettles, and things like that. And actually, it produced some of the most beautiful cookware and things like that you could possibly imagine. It won Design Council awards right in the 1960s. But so companies like Judge, the brand is still going, although I don't think it has anything to do with the Black Country anymore. But if you look up antique Judge ware, it's the most beautiful stuff. So yes, they made a lot of buckets, and that kind of galvanizing would have been part of that. But it was relevant to other industries as well, kind of enameling and plating and that kind of thing. All absolutely went in the Black Country.
Wow. The Beverly's got a good question that came through. Can you recommend any good websites for research in the Black Country, both for history and genealogy? Her ancestors and their descendants were miners, nailers, and brickmakers. And I can think of a couple of good websites already. Findmypast isn't half bad. We got lots of records from Staffordshire, Worcestershire, Warwickshire, and other places. And particularly our newspaper is also on the British Newspaper Archive. You can't move for wonderful things in there. And our trade directories on Findmypast are really good too. But are there any other websites that they might want to check out and could help?
For sure. The key one I'd recommend is it's the other right address. It's blackcountryhistory.org, which is the combined archive catalogue for the 4 Black Country boroughs, Wolverhampton, Walsall. So Wolverhampton covers the city of Wolverhampton and also Bilston and Wensfield. Walsall covers Darlaston, parts of Willenhall. Dudley covers Dudley, Stourbridge, and Halesowen. Those are the main areas, and Sedgley. And then Sandwell is the one with a made-up name that was given it in the 1970s, and that covers Tipton, West Bromwich, Smethwick, Rowley Regis, Wednesbury, and various others in between. So, but the advantage of this is that you can search across all 4 and narrow it down by various settings, which is great, because one of the difficulties about doing family history or any kind of history in the Black Country is that it's spread between so many different authorities. So by the time it was all reformed in the 1960s, there were 22 separate local authorities just in this small area, which was mad because nothing could ever get done, really. So they hated the fact that they had to be reformed, and there were campaigns to keep things local and not be taken over by Wolverhampton or whatever. But they were quite parochial and quite made it difficult for them to actually do big infrastructural works or anything. So it crosses the boundary between Staffordshire and Worcestershire, and there's all these sort of local internal rivalries and things like that, which makes it impossible to find statistics that cover for the Black Country. Like I'm always getting asked for how many people are doing this job in this Black Country. Can't say, impossible. But that website will get you most of the way you need to go.
Fantastic. And I've seen a few people talking about their own ancestors. Heather's Aston ancestors were tinplate workers in Bilston, and Angel's Cashmore family designed a gun for the Royal Irish Constabulary, which sounds like that's quite a story there. Yeah. And Emma's grandfather was a steel worker, so I can see this big broad range of talents. And Kelly's ancestors in Stourbridge were called Chance, but she's not found a link yet to Chance Glass. But there's always a chance if you look closely enough. I know that I can surely see Ellie giving me a disapproving look because of my chance to get a pun in. But it wouldn't be a Findmypast from home without at least one from me. So now we've got our quota full, we can get back to doing some research and things. Cindy has got a good one. She said her father worked at IMI Whitton metal bashing, producing sheets of metal for the car industry and Royal Mint, amongst others. And their parents also did a short stint at Cadbury's before they were born. Now, I remember Cadbury's and Cadbury's World and things from visiting myself. And is Bourneville in the Black Country?
No, Bourneville's in Birmingham, and the Cadbury factory is
Right.
right in the middle of it. It's beautiful. It's this kind of model village that was built for the workers at Bourneville. So that still comes under Birmingham, as does Witton and some of those other places, I think. But we've never got anything quite like that in the Black Country. There was because of I guess perhaps the scale of the employers was that bit smaller. Nobody had the desire to do a kind of a beautiful model village like Port Sunlight or Saltaire or one of those kind of places. Housing in the Black Country tended to be extremely rough. One of our most famous houses on the site is our Tilted Cottage, which is because you can still drive across the Black Country and see houses which are tilted into the ground because of mining subsidence, and moving that brick by brick with the tilt in situ, as you can imagine, was quite the logistical challenge. So if you ever get a chance to visit the Black Country, go to the Crooked House pub, and you will see it's so twisted it looks like you can roll a marble uphill in it. It's completely disorientating, but that's quite typical of the Black Country. When we were doing the planning commission for our site, for this new we got the maps out, and there's 48 coal shafts just on our 26-acre site, so it's absolutely riddled with holes across the Black Country. So it's no surprise really.
I see some questions. I see Janine has asked, what is I think that's a Whitesmith, and I think I know the answer in that. But where were Whitesmiths, and what were Whitesmiths in the Black Country, Simon?
Whitesmith, I think, is to do with tin plating and tin work.
Yeah, I had that as white iron. You know, they call it white ironsmith. Other things, you've got the blacksmith with the dark metals, and Whitesmith the light ones. But certainly somebody mentioned Bilston already for tinsmithing, didn't they? And Wolverhampton as well. Those would have been centres of that. Kind of related trades would be enamelling. So Bilston was famous for, well, Bilston Enamels was quite a famous brand for a long time, and Japanning as well. So this is kind of a similar kind of coating process, but with a very thick lacquer. And Japanware from Wolverhampton and Bilston is something with a very long history and is very sought after. Well, it's ironic. Janine has just commented that her Allgood family invented Japanning. So as I saw that come up and you said it, so it's always interesting how these things come together, and we'll always have a connection somewhere with family history. And I see a few people saying about people who left the Black Country. Anne's Duke's Winstanley families left the Black Country and then lived in Lancashire and Yorkshire to work in the coal mines. Was there any kind of history of I'd say we've got a lot of inward migration, but did people leave? Perhaps, I know in Cornwall the mines dried up and things like that. Was there something similar in the Black Country?
There was more isolated instances, but people definitely did. So there was mining in the Black Country up until 1968. So people were able to stay employed if they wished. Most people, especially after the Second World War, moved if they could. They would move into something like working in car component assembly because it paid so much better. However, other people did move away. So some examples include there was a group of miners that moved from Bilston to village of Royston, just the other side of Barnsley, when a new mine opened up there. And there's a really interesting research project that was done a little while ago tracing the Black Country dialect as it's transmitted into the Yorkshire dialect. So that's a really interesting way of looking at it. There was another group that was moved to Pendlebury, which is now in the city of Salford, and a mine there. They didn't realise it at the time, but they were being taken in as blacklegs, so to strike breakers. To break the strike, but they stayed there, and there's an area that was nicknamed Little Bilston for a while. My favourite one that I've only discovered recently was that in 1904, a Wolverhampton firm opened a new factory in Ellesmere Port, which is on the Wirral, and at the opposite end of the Shropshire Union Canal from Wolverhampton. And they opened a new factory there and employed about 2,000 or 3,000 people from the Black Country, most of whom walked all the way along the canal towpath. Wow. So there's now there's an estate in Ellesmere Port now called Wolverham, and all these connections. So I have to be careful I don't get into trouble and show allegiance, but we have two major football clubs in the Black Country. West Brom and Wolves. So Stan Cullis, who was the captain of Wolves for a while, was born in Ellesmere Port to Wolverhampton parents that had walked there in the early time and became captain of Wolves and for England as well. So, I think it's a great story.
It's amazing. So Emma's just commented her minor great-grandfather's minor brothers moved to mines in South Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire. One of them might have been in that group that you just mentioned who moved from Bilston to Barnsley. Her great-great-grandmother went with him and died in the Barnsley area. So it's interesting to, again, put some story to that. It's great. And in terms of, I know you mentioned about moving forward through time. And we've got a great way of looking at a cross-section of the population from 1841 to 1911 and soon 1921 as well, with the 1921 census. And what a lot of people aren't so aware about is the 1921 census has your employer on, so you'll be able to see who you worked for and things. At this point, I know you talked about some factories. Are we still looking at the small businesses, or have we moved to a larger, some more industrial way of working at this point?
In the 20s and 30s?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say time is marching on for definite. That sort of system would have been more and more relegated to some of the more traditional industries. So the handmade stuff, the old-fashioned chain making. I mean, it's still plenty of it. So like chain making and nail making have pretty much died out in this form, but chain making was still a going concern. However, Wolverhampton had the Black Country had its various ups and downs economically speaking, and at various times had to kind of re-diversify into different things. And by the 20s and 30s, it had to kind of re-diversify away from some of the very heavy industry, raw materials like coal and iron extraction and steel making, and move towards engineering work and lighter industry. So we had a burst of car manufacturing in the first part of the 20th century. And we're still making, Wolverhampton in particular was still making lots of motorbikes. It was quite famous for brands like AJS and Sunbeam. And those were kind of naturally bigger employers. And you also tend to get a kind of a swathe of mergers and acquisitions as well. So like the nuts and bolts is a good example. In Darlaston, there was loads of these small masters, and they gradually all got subsumed into other much larger concerns. The biggest of which was another very large fastenings firm, so screws and nuts and bolts in Smethwick, Gueskeen and Nettlefold, which we know now as GKN. And they were absolutely huge and had tentacles absolutely everywhere across the Black Country. But they kind of swallowed up a lot of these larger employers. So some of them would have remained saying they worked for this small employer when in fact it would just be under this umbrella company. But some of them would be saying, "Well, no, I'm a GKN man. That's my business," and it would have been good. It would have meant job prospects and job security and improved conditions and things.
And I see Chris has mentioned that they were walking at dawn this morning along the Shropshire Union Canal. So they were, again, following in the footsteps of so many who've gone before. Hopefully you didn't walk that far, Chris, because it might take a bit longer to get back. And a question from Janet. Some of her Birmingham ancestors were suffer makers. Was this a cottage industry or was this something bigger?
Suffer makers? No, it's not what I've come across. I wonder if it's snuffer. Like a candle snuffer, that would be a possibility, because any small item made out of metal could be found being made in the Black Country. If it was brass, it might even be in Birmingham tended to specialise more in brass than the Black Country did. But I don't know what a suffer maker is, but I'm wondering if it was snuffer.
Yeah, I don't know that one myself, so I'm not sure. But if anyone else has any ideas in the comments, yeah, it is snuffer. It's just come through. So there we go. So you had it right. So well done on that one. And Daphne's got another question of, do you know if the average lifespan was lower here than in other areas of the country in the 1800s?
Yeah, it was.
That's a quick answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from the kind of the mid-century, every town across the country had some sort of health and conditions survey. and almost every town in the country wanted to be a bit dramatic about it and said, "Oh, yeah, mine was the worst. Our town's got the most shocking conditions. We need to do this, this, and this." Dudley, I think, the life expectancy was about 16 in the middle of the 19th century, which obviously doesn't mean that people lived on average to 16. It just meant that there was a huge amount of infant mortality. So that would be explained by a couple of things. Firstly, the propensity for epidemic disease in the Black Country. So cholera absolutely ravaged the region. Bilston, in particular, was one of the worst hit places in the entire country. About 5% of the population died in 1832. So infant mortality and youth mortality would have been very, very high. But also work was just extremely dangerous. So if you're a miner in the Black Country, the problem with having an extremely abundant seam of coal is that if your masters would send you down and say, just cut it away, leave a bit of the coal as a pillar, and cut around it, and then move on to the next bit, rather than it being in low seams where you'd have to go in sideways or whatever. The system was called pillar and stall, and that was fine, but it was really, really dangerous. It meant the roof would collapse on a regular basis. So across the Black Country, the death rate amongst miners was higher than anywhere else in the country, and that's not because of big explosions like in some other places with fire damp gas or anything, but it was because of the sheer number of these mining accidents, roof falls, and sort of ones and twos being killed. So it was an extremely dangerous place to live, really. Most of the industries came with some sort of occupational hazard, whether it was boiler explosions or some sort of noxious gases from foundry work or whatever it might be.
It's amazing. I know that it's hard to comprehend with our health and safety and things that we have now, just how dangerous it was to go to work and earn a living every day, and people put their lives in their hands quite a lot. And as we're getting closer to the end, I know that the Black Country and things like that have been represented in media a fair bit, and I'm sure we've all watched movies and TV shows and things that have the Black Country as a setting or focus on it or anything like that. Are there any in particular that you might want to recommend for being particularly good or bad in representing what life was like at different points in history?
That's a good question. So I mentioned Dickens earlier. Old Curiosity Shop. The other one that famously mentions the Black Country in that period is it's called Sybil by Benjamin Disraeli, who was later Prime Minister. He was a novelist before he was Prime Minister. I mean, I'm not sure I'd recommend it as a literary endeavour. Particularly, it's a bit on the tedious side, but it's he talks about will and all in particular, and life as that. His thesis was that the country was being separated into two nations, the rich and the poor. Other than that, we kind of tend to get forgotten after Birmingham a bit, and Birmingham itself, the Old Midlands, gets forgotten. The country gets divided into North and South, and the Midlands gets left out. Peaky Blinders is actually set in Birmingham, although it's filmed at the Black Country Museum quite a lot. I'm just trying to think now what I'd recommend.
Well, it's a big question, but it's one of those ones that lets everyone let out their the things that they're watching and they're reading and things like that. So I always love it.
I mean, basically everybody says the same thing, which is that it's ugly, it's polluted. So J.B. Priestley mentions it in English Journey and talks about it. The line I liked of his was that he says, "Oh, it's Wolverhampton and Wednesfield and Willenhall and Walsall. You might as well call them all wilderness and be done with it." And various other people describe it as this kind of awful sense. Maybe if I was going to recommend one, I'd recommend a novel called Cage of Shadows by Archie Hill, who grew up not far from Dudley. It's been reprinted not too long ago, and it's fairly kind of brutal about his upbringing as the hardship of poverty and things like that. That's probably the closest I'd get to a fictional representation of the Black Country that really rings true to me.
Well, I see Emma's noted her great uncle Harry Harrison was a Black Country poet and comedian. I don't know if you know of him. Not high culture, but you can see him there, and there's a link to a video about Cradley Heath Market. So that might be worth taking a look at, and I'm sure we'll hear that lovely Black Country accent as well.
Yeah, well,
I've got a question.
If you can find it on YouTube, you can find Harry Harrison, because he was part of kind of a troupe called Black Country Night Out, and they did recordings of their comedy sets. And if you want a good example of the Black Country accent, listen to some of the speakers and the comedians there. I mean, the humour is a bit on the dated side, but the accents are wonderful.
That's brilliant. And Val has asked, and we've talked about mining quite a lot, but can you explain how and when the Black Country mining industry went into decline?
I'd say the peak of mining, the peak of output, would have been about the 1860s. And from the 1870s, there was various economic shocks and things like that caused the whole industry to go into decline. The main things are that it became really much more economically viable to get your coal from somewhere else. Firstly, from South Wales or from Yorkshire or from Scotland. The Black Country mines had a real tendency to flood. And become pretty useless. The landscape was kind of riddled with these holes, as we've said, and therefore it was kind of getting quite difficult to work on. And then eventually it just kind of became unfeasible thing economically speaking. So the last mine closed in 1968. There's still plenty of coal under there. It's just cheaper now to import it from other parts of the world. And of course, we rely so much less on coal now. So that was the other thing. 1968, if I've got my dates right, was also when we switched from town gas to natural gas. And you use coal to make town gas in those old gas holders and great big gasworks that every town used to have. No longer any need for them. So obviously demand for coal fell quite dramatically from that.
That's, I see Angels said that she can remember coal being brought along the canal in Langley, and she was born in 1954, and she remembers the mine at Rowley Regis. So I'm guessing that ties in quite neatly with those years, and we can see an industry changing quite a lot, and it's fascinating to see. So in our final couple of minutes, if anyone else has any more questions to throw in quickly, we can see what we can get to. But it's fantastic to see all of your stories, and it's really good to hear about the Black Country Living History Museum, especially the very difficult work of preserving these buildings and bringing the history itself to a different audience, which is really exciting. Is there any particular thing that you do in your job as genealogists? I think we're all really excited, and someone gets to research all of these histories and these stories and things. What's the most exciting kind of thing that you have found in that role?
I don't know, but my role is so varied at the moment because partly I'm sort of researching the general history of the Black Country and looking up things like how safe it was to be a miner in the 19th century. And so that's fascinating. But then on the other hand, I'm looking at exactly what sort of shelving or electrics we should be putting into these new buildings to make it look appropriately 1960s and things like that. So there's some really quite diverse things you have to cover. I was Googling the history of twin slot shelving earlier today. You know, that's the sort of the range of things that I have to cover. I'm really excited for our new project. That's certainly the most exciting thing that's going on at the moment. You know, it's such a big project. It's a £30 million investment, and we're building 22 buildings. So it's really it's the biggest development that there's been at the Black Country Museum since it opened. We're including houses, factories, an NHS infant welfare clinic, a library, various shops, a pub from Wolverhampton. The pub is maybe my favourite building out of it. We picked it because it was beautiful. It was knocked down, so we're building it in replica. And it's one of these Edwardian ceramic coated pubs called the Elephant and Castle. And it's when we started digging into it and talking to people who'd drunk there or who'd run the pub, they said, "Oh, well, a lot of our customers in the 60s and 70s were Irish," and then others came up saying, "Oh, I remember my dad moved from India and he used to drink there on a regular basis," or "My dad moved from the Caribbean, used to play dominoes there." And it's become this great example of this kind of melting pot that was the Black Country in the post-war period, all these new people meeting and getting along and telling stories of people getting along rather than just people not getting along, which is so much more prevalent in history, really. And it turns out that pub that I'm researching was just a few minutes up the road from the the Irish Quarter in Wolverhampton that I'm researching for my PhD 100 years before. So it's really nice tie-in.
That's great. And I see a lot of people saying as well that they're looking forward to getting to the museum when it opens. Some happy memories of people that have been there and some other people that now definitely want to come and visit. I'm going to get one more question in just as we finish off. Janine's asked, were there women coal miners? And that's something I think will apply to the whole country that maybe you might be able to help out with.
There were regional variations on this. So in some parts of the country, women were employed underground, as were children. That was supposed to be abolished in the 1840s, although, of course, it went on as long as some people could get away with. In the Black Country, that was less typical. There were still children sent underground, but they were operated the trapdoors. Women didn't tend to go to work underground. They worked on the banks sorting the coal, so they were often referred to as pit bonk wenches. So that's my attempt at a Black Country accent. I'm not going to say bonk rather than bank, and wenches rather than women. So they worked up on the top sorting the coal. Lots and lots of women's employment in other industries, though. So most famously, chain making in Cradley Heath was done partly by women. So men would often go to the factory and earn quite a good wage. Women would also be expected to work in a small forge at the back of the garden for 12 hours of the day for much, much reduced wages, and then have dinner on the table and look after the baby and everything like that. So their famous story is that in 1911, they went on strike, the women chain makers, for the first minimum wage in this country's history and managed to win it. So we're quite justifiably proud of that, I think. In brick making as well, that was the other industry that employed a huge number of women, really making the bricks from scratch. So I don't know if you saw them do it on the pottery throwdown not too long ago, but they were you have to take great lumps of clay, throw it into a wooden mold, take some real strength, but women would be doing that and making thousands of bricks a day. So you wouldn't mess, I think. Lots of these industries as well that were making small items, nails and locks and things, huge employers of women.
It's interesting to see that this character is it's a sort of equality of kinds, particularly with this minimum wage and things. It's great to see that the Black Country made some strides forward, not just in technology and industry, but also on social levels and things like that as well. And that's quite a nice way to round it off. And I can see everyone saying thank you. There are so many people saying, Heather said, Simon, you need to have a Zoom meeting with my 93-year-old dad from Bilston.
Oh, lovely. Yeah. Great.
And I think, yes, a lot of people are really happy with this. So thanks very much to you, Simon, for coming and joining us. And your book, if you remind us of the title and when it's out, because I think a lot of people might be really interested in picking that up. I'm going to look out for it too.
It's called Forging Ahead. Subtitle is Austerity to Prosperity, 1945 to 1968. And it's coming out at the end of May with History West Midlands Press.
That's brilliant. So we'll look out for that, and I'm sure we'll make sure to let everyone know when that comes as well. And there are so many other questions we could ask and so many other things we could talk about. I'll have to talk to you again at some point soon. But thanks so much for joining us, and thank you everyone else as well for being with us. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you again very soon. There's another thing in 15 minutes time or so, just at 5:15. Ellie is going to be showing off some brand new things from our Findmypast commercials that are coming, so they'll be really interesting to watch as well. And on Friday, I think we have Jen Baldwin as well talking about the latest records, because there are always some great records every Friday. That's worth checking in and tuning in for. But other than that, I will see you again very soon. And thanks very much for coming. Thanks a lot, and take care.